And so I need to give you a massive flashing red warning here. What I'm about to say is quite disturbing. There's a lot of uncomfortable language. And if you are triggered or upset by sex assaults and violent assaults, etc., then this is definitely not the show for you tonight.
Being an elite cleaner is a lifestyle that not everyone really understands. When I chat about my job, a lot of folks picture these stunning mansions that seem endless, filled with designer furniture and views that look straight out of a dream. Honestly, they're not totally wrong. I've walked on rugs that were pricier than my childhood home and polished chandeliers that sparkle like stars in the night sky. Honestly, it's not as glamorous as it might seem. People don't really consider the dirt I deal with not the stuff you can easily wash off, but the kind that clings to a person's soul when the wealthy and influential reach out there not just after someone to clean up. They want someone who can make their blenders disappear there. Not looking for a cleaner they want. Someone who can wipe away the evidence, someone who can handle the burdens they think are too heavy to bear on their own. You wouldn't believe some of the things I've seen that would definitely make anyone curious about what's really happening behind those shiny doors. You wouldn't believe the places I've found drug residue stashed away. It's almost like it's hiding in plain sight, just waiting for someone like me to stumble upon it. Some toys and accessories are so personal and revealing that their owners would probably swear they never even had them. And sometimes you'll even find live animals, but not the typical ones. More like some really exotic creatures. It was like finding an old souvenir from some night when they had a bit too much fun. I remember this one time I came across a snake all curled up in a bathroom sink. I totally froze, half thinking it would strike, but it just stared back at me, feeling just as out of place as I did. I was pretty good at my job, quiet, efficient, and intentionally not too invested. Being curious wasn't just looked down upon, it could really get you into trouble. My job was pretty simple: get rid of the chaos, bring back some order, and make sure everything looked normal. When I was done for a bit, that did the trick. After years of cleaning up messes that no one ever mentions, you really start to feel the burden of it all. Every mess tells a story, don't you think? Sometimes it's really loud, like the sound of broken glass and furniture being flipped over that just shouts of anger or fear. Sometimes it's a bit more understated, like the light mark left by a wine glass on a table that someone hurriedly cleaned up. Those stories really linger, don't they? It's like that smell of stale alcohol that just won't go away no matter how many windows you throw open. Honestly, I don't think anything could have prepared me for that call. It was meant to be just another job, a special cleaning at a huge Beverly Hills mansion owned by one of the biggest names in entertainment that day. My bosses tone felt different, more cold and sharp. Hey, just so you know, this is confidential. He said, just focus on getting the job done. No questions or curiosity are needed. But there was a part of me that held back. Honestly, I wasn't sure if it was just my gut feeling or pure fear. But for the first time in ages, I actually considered saying, no, I know I probably should have. But honestly, the payoff was just too good to resist. It seemed like one of those deals that was just too good to be true, too pressing. Almost like they were trying to lock in my silence before I even arrived back. Then I had no clue that I wasn't just starting a job. I was actually uncovering a secret, something I was never meant to discover. Getting a call to clean in Beverly Hills was just another day for me. I've been in homes that felt like museums, where every surface gleamed with a kind of wealth that's tough to picture. It was clear this job was different the instant my boss called me. He tends to steer clear of calling me directly and likes to keep things a bit more surface level. This time he really took charge, talking in short, sharp sentences as if he were holding back a bit. Hey, we've got an emergency, he said. So you'll be working in a basement. Just get the work done. No questions needed. There was this thing in his voice, a bit of hesitation, like he was trying to give me a heads up without crossing any lines. I really had no idea what I was getting myself into. The house we're talking about used to belong to Diddy, who's definitely one of the biggest names in the entertainment world. Everyone knew his name, and I'd heard a ton of stories about his legendary parties. Those wild events where everything was over the top and there were no boundaries. When I arrived at the mansion, it felt like I had stepped right into one of those areas. There are broken bottles scattered across the shiny floor and abandoned glasses balancing precariously on the edges of fancy furniture. The air is heavy with the scent of cigarettes blended with something even more intense. The mansion was just breathtaking, like it came right out of a magazine or a music video. The marble floors stretched endlessly, reflecting the light from the massive chandeliers that lit up the room as if it were daytime. The walls were adorned with modern art pieces that probably cost more than what many folks spend on their houses. The whole place just oozed luxury, but there was definitely something off about the vibe. Under all that grandeur, there was a tension, a quiet sense that something wasn't quite right. You couldn't see it, but you could definitely feel it, like the house was keeping some secrets to itself. I bumped into the team leader, a familiar face from back in the day. Usually he was pretty chill and composed, but today he felt a little tense. He barely looked up and gestured toward a staircase over to the side. "You take care of the basement," he said in a hurry, as if he wanted to get it out before he could second guess himself the lower level. You know, I've noticed something over the years. When someone says to go to the basement, it's usually not for a good reason. Basements are like the secret hideaways where folks tuck away all the things they'd rather keep out of sight. The clutter that's just too overwhelming, too shadowy, or too questionable to be on display. There are secrets hanging around here, and it seems like no one comes to someone like me unless they're looking to make those secrets vanish. I was at the top of the staircase, just taking a moment to look down as I walked into the dark depths. I couldn't help but feel that whatever was waiting for me down there would stay with me for a long time. But you know how it goes with jobs like this, right? They come with their own rules. No questions asked, no second guessing, and absolutely no looking back. As I walked down the staircase, I could feel the air shifting around me. It wasn't just cooler, it felt heavier, damp, and almost stale, like it had been stuck there for years. With every step I took, the sound bounced around the small space, and I could feel the unease in my chest getting stronger. I've dealt with my fair share of unique tasks before, and they always seemed a bit more challenging than just cleaning up spilled drinks or fixing furniture. This wasn't just about cleaning up after a crazy night. What was waiting for me down there wasn't just a mess. It was something that would grab hold of my mind and stick with me forever. When I finally got to the bottom, it felt like a wave hit me. I felt a shiver run up my spine, not because it was cold, but because of the heavy atmosphere around me. The basement felt totally different from the fancy mansion above. No more marble floors or shiny chandeliers. Instead, the walls were dark, the ceiling felt low, and those fluorescent lights kept flickering, creating some weird fleeting shadows. Shadows seemed to dance around, and the air felt almost electric, like the space was holding on to secrets whispered within its walls. It quickly became clear that this wasn't just a storage area or some forgotten utility room. No, this place was built for something else entirely. The plush, soundproof walls, the dim lighting, and the faint scent of expensive cigars lingering in the air told me everything I needed to know. This was a space meant for private parties, the kind that no one wanted the world to know about. The unsettling contrast between the luxury upstairs and the suffocating secrecy of the basement made my stomach twist. Whatever went down here was definitely not meant for anyone to see, and it was my job to keep it that way. Right in the middle of the basement, under the dim flickering light, there was a small stage. The metal rods gleamed coldly, catching what little light managed to reach them. Their shiny surfaces seemed a bit out of place among all the surrounding chaos, and the floor had its own tale to tell. Heel marks were dragged through sticky patches, drink stains overlapping one another, and something darker and thicker clung to my shoes. With every step, it left a faint, unpleasant resistance. As I moved to one side, a bar stretched along the wall, but unlike the pristine high-end bars upstairs, this one looked like it had weathered something far more. Half full bottles, looking a bit sinister, were left behind, some tipped over and spilling a yellowish liquid into shallow puddles that shimmered softly in the dim light. The counter was a mess with thin lines and scattered traces of white powder still hanging around. It was like a quiet admission of the wild night that had just passed, a chaotic reminder of all the excess and recklessness that went down. The furniture had a story that was even darker. Armchairs that are torn formed, the fabrics were all askew with sofas that had cushions stained and sagging, holding on to stories that were probably best forgotten. In the corner, there was a broken chair that seemed to be stuck in time. Its wood all splintered, its jagged and raw, almost like a piece of evidence. You can easily imagine someone being thrown against it. It wasn't just the dirt and grime from a wild party. It felt like the aftermath of something violent, something that couldn't be brushed off with laughter and excuses. But the most unsettling part was the silence. It hung in the air like a heavy weight, making the tension in the room even more palpable. The chaotic state of space felt like time had stopped, but the heavy silence somehow made everything feel alive, sending chills down my spine. Every sound, I made a soft squeak of my shoe, the dull scrape of my cloth across the table echoed back endlessly, almost like the walls were mocking me. It felt like the basement was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. As I cleaned, that unsettling sensation of being watched began to creep over me. It wasn't the usual unease you get when you catch someone staring from across the room. No, this was deeper, harder to pinpoint. Like the walls themselves had eyes, the basement felt alive in a way that made my skin prickle. Every shadow was a little too dark, and every corner too quiet. I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself to concentrate on what I needed to do. This wasn't the moment to let my mind wander. Then I caught sight of it. There's something odd going on behind the bar. One of the wooden panels didn't quite line up with the others. It was subtle, almost invisible, but my trained eye noticed it. My hand paused as I moved the cloth over the surface, and that's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible click. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. Slowly, I pressed my hand against the panel, and it slid aside with an unsettling smoothness, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. Behind it was a heavy trap, its rusty hinges and weathered locks contrasting sharply with the sleek design of the basement. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the door, my instinct yelling at me to stop, to push the panel back, and act like I hadn't seen it, but I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity, adrenaline, or just plain stupidity. I was crouched down, my fingers shaking as they gripped the latch. Taking a deep breath, I pulled it open, and the sound of the rusty hinges creaking was almost deafening in the heavy silence of the basement. It echoed like a warning, settling into my chest like a weight. The door opened slowly, revealing an iron staircase spiraling down into darkness. The smell hit me before I even had a chance to take in what I was seeing, a thick, overwhelming blend of mold, rust, and something else. It was foul, acrid, and just plain natural. I grabbed my flashlight, my fingers a bit clumsy as I turned it on, and the beam of light sliced through the darkness. As I tried to light up the staircase, it felt like no matter where I pointed the beam, the light just got swallowed up, almost like the staircase went on forever. The darkness below seemed to have a life of its own, tugging at me with a low, eerie hum. My heart raced, and for a split second, I thought about turning back, but it was like something invisible was guiding me, and before I knew it, I had my foot on the first step. I pushed back the growing panic and started to make my way down. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound bouncing off the walls and fading into the darkness below. The cold metal stairs pressed against the soles of my shoes, reminding me of the reality of my situation. With every step, the air felt heavier, almost like it was trying to hold me back. My hands were sweaty as I gripped the rail tightly, my mind racing with all sorts of thoughts. I tried to tell myself this was just an old storage room left behind and forgotten, but deep down I knew that wasn't the case. That uneasy feeling in my gut was telling me there was something more going on. When I finally reached the bottom, the silence I had gotten used to was suddenly replaced by a low, faint hum. It wasn't loud, but it vibrated through the air like some distant electricity flowing through unseen wires. I swung my flashlight around. Its beam sliced through the darkness to show a narrow tunnel ahead. The walls were rough concrete, damp and cold, but what really caught my eye were the scratches. At first I thought they were just random marks from wear and tear, but the closer I looked, the more intentional they appeared. Some were shallow and thin, like they'd been made by human fingernails, while others were wide, deep, and jagged. The kind of marks that made my skin crawl as I wondered what could have caused them. My throat felt tight as I ran the flashlight over the scratches, my mind racing to keep the worst thoughts at bay. The scent hit me harder. It was almost overwhelming. It was more than just mold and rust. Beneath those familiar scents was something far more sinister, a sharp, sickening stench that reminded me of rotting meat. I had to lean against the wall for a moment, trying not to gag. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, and with each step there was this unsettling hum that just wouldn't quit, that got louder the further I went. And then I reached the point where the passage split into two ways. To the left was just pure, suffocating darkness. My flashlight couldn't cut through it, like the void was swallowing the light. But to the right, something more tangible caught my eye. A big, rusty metal door stood at the end of the tunnel. Its surface was marked with dark stains that had dried up over time, creating brittle trails that reached down to the floor. Near the top of the door, there was a small circular window, just big enough to take a peek through. Even though what was beyond was cloaked in darkness, my legs felt like ice, and my instincts were yelling at me to turn back. Whatever was behind that door wasn't meant to be discovered, at least not by me or anyone else, but I couldn't help it. Something stronger than fear was pushing me forward, urging me to see what lay behind that rusty steel barrier. Each step felt heavier, as if I were crossing an invisible line. I could never shake off the urge to run as I reached the door. My hand trembled above the worn, icy doorknob. My reflection in the circular window looked back at me, all warped and eerie under the dim light. It felt like the glass was trying to warn me, telling me this wasn't a place I was meant to enter. But something deeper than curiosity tugged at me, a compulsion. I just couldn't ignore swallowing the lump in my throat. I gathered every bit of courage I had and pushed the door open, the sound deafening. The metal creaked, breaking the silence and echoing down the tunnel like a scream. What's up beyond the door really made my stomach twist and drop. In the middle of the room, there was this single dim bulb swinging above, and right below it stood an industrial freezer. Its steel surface was all scratched and stained, making it the grim centerpiece of the room. Steel shelves lined the walls, each one stacked with neat rows of boxes and vacuum-sealed bags. It was the labels that grabbed my attention first. They weren't just brands or inventory numbers. They were full names written quickly in a shaky, irregular script. My breath caught as I scanned the shelves, the names looking back at me like silent accusations. I was trying to make sense of everything, but nothing seemed to add up. Every instinct was telling me to get out of there, but I found myself reaching out and grabbing one of the bags. The plastic felt cold and slick in my hand, damp with condensation. When I held it up to the weak light, my stomach turned. The meat just didn't feel right. It was definitely not what you'd expect. It was this dark red color mixed with a yellowish gray, and there were these veins that looked unmistakably organic, almost disturbingly human. I felt my grip slip a bit, and for a second I really thought I might drop tea. My hands were shaking as I pushed the bag back onto the shelf, really trying to calm my racing thoughts. As my flashlight moved around the room, it hit something on the wall that made my heart race, lurching. I noticed a corkboard that was hung crookedly, cluttered with photographs pinned in a haphazard way. The faces in those photos sent chills down my spine. Politicians, celebrities, and businessmen. People who made it to the headlines and magazine covers, but their poses fell off, their expressions empty, and their eyes looked glassy and lifeless, almost like they were just mannequins or something even more unsettling. Many of the photos were smudged with dark stains, the edges curling as if they had been handled with bloody hands. My light shifted lower, illuminating the corner of the board where a yellow sheet of paper was pinned. Scrawled across it in thick, uneven strokes was a chilling message. Invitation only. I stood frozen, the weight of what I had stumbled into crashing down on me. This wasn't just a secret. It was something monstrous, something that shouldn't exist, and here I was, right in the middle of it. I stepped back from the freezer, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Every instinct was telling me to leave, to put as much distance between myself and this place as I could, but something deeper, maybe curiosity or a twisted sense of obligation, pulled me to take one more step forward. My trembling hand reached for the freezer's latch, which resisted at first, as if it were guarding its secrets, but I forced it open, and the sound was sharp and metallic, like a scream echoing through the room, inside more vacuum-sealed. Bags were stacked neatly, each one labeled with a name. I noticed some familiar names. I really wish I hadn't felt my stomach churn as I looked at the bags, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was something worse, something I couldn't even start to process. My hands shook uncontrollably as I closed the freezer, the latch clicking back into place like it was sealing a tomb. Then I heard a faint creaking sound coming from behind me. My heart stopped. I spun around, my flashlight slicing through the heavy darkness. It was dark, and the room felt empty. Or at least that's what I thought, but there was this nagging feeling like someone was watching me, and it was almost too much to handle. It felt like invisible eyes were following my every move. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on me. I knew I had to get out of there. I stumbled back toward the tunnel, my steps shaky but fast. With each step, the smell got worse, the stench of decay and rot clinging to me like a second skin. The darkness curled and chained shadows were creating shapes that just didn't make sense. I really didn't want to, but my flashlight flickered, and for a terrifying moment, I was surrounded by total darkness. The walls felt like they were closing and suffocating me with their silence. When I finally reached the iron staircase, I didn't even stop to catch my breath. I climbed as fast as I could, each step creaking under my weight, almost like the darkness below was trying to pull me back down. My legs were burning, and my hands kept slipping on the cold metal. But I didn't stop until I burst back into the basement. Above, the light was blinding, harsh, and unnatural. After the heavy darkness, it didn't feel like safety, though it felt like I had brought something with me, like the basement's presence was still clinging to me, refusing to let go. I made my way through the rest of the basement, just scrubbing and cleaning without really thinking about it. It felt like I was going through the motions. My mind was blank, and my body was on autopilot. All I wanted was to get out of there. As I stepped outside the mansion, I noticed a bunch of blue vans parked in the driveway. Uniformed guys were unloading stacks of pizza boxes, moving in this eerie, synchronized way. They didn't say a word or even look my way, and their precise movement sent a chill down my spine. It felt so wrong, but honestly, I just wanted to get out of there to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. As I drove away, I glanced back at the mansion. Its glowing lights cut through the night, like everything was perfectly normal. Just another sprawling Beverly Hills estate. But I knew better. That place was hiding more than just wealth and power. It was concealing something much darker, something that couldn't be explained or justified. The further I drove, the heavier the air felt. Like I hadn't really left it all behind at all. In the days that followed, I felt paranoia wrapping around me tightly. I started seeing white SUVs parked close to my house with their engines running, but they never came any closer. So there I was getting these anonymous calls at the weirdest hours, the voice on the other end totally silent. It felt like a little nudge reminding me of what I'd witnessed, and the cost of being curious had hit me hard, that I had accidentally walked into something way bigger than me, something that felt untouchable, unspoken, and wrapped in darkness. I really struggled to wrap my head around it, but it wasn't only the threats that lingered in my mind. The tunnels just wouldn't leave my mind. Their heavy presence kept creeping into my dreams. I noticed the symbols carved into the concrete walls. These ancient designs looked like they were alive, pulsing with a creepy energy. As I kept my gaze on them, the room with the cages stuck with me. You know, those claw marks and the dark stains underneath them really made an impression. The faint metallic tang of iron haunted me like an unfinished nightmare. Those pristine white robes, stained only where they brushed against the bars, left me with questions I didn't want answers to. But the worst part was the freezer. I could still feel that cold metal latch against my fingers and see the names written on the bags. The photographs pinned to the corkboard felt lifeless, their smudged faces staring back at me. The deep scratches carved into the door were desperate marks that I knew would stick with me forever. Each image replayed in my mind like a broken reel I couldn't turn off. Even in my own home, I didn't feel safe. The creak in the floorboards and the faint hum of electricity at night sent chills through me, pulling me back to that dark basement. The world I once thought I knew now felt so thin, as if behind every polished surface lay a darkness just waiting to be uncovered. I carried the weight of what I'd seen everywhere. I was an annoying presence I couldn't shake, and still those white SUVs lingered at the edge of my vision, always just out of reach. A quiet reminder that I had crossed the line to silent. Phone calls just kept coming, like a reminder that someone was always listening, even when all I heard was static. I could sense the unspoken message. I wasn't free, so here I am faced with a choice. Sharing this story might turn out to be the biggest mistake I ever make, or it could be the only way to finally break free from the shadows that still linger around me. Maybe the only way to break free is to shine a light on it, or perhaps by sharing this I've just made things worse, letting the nightmare creep in even more. Either way, it's too late. Now the story's out there, and so am I.